It's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, rather good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, good. So, let me begin by thanking the organizers of Kshitij for inviting me here to speak to you. You may wonder what an economist is going to do today at a technology festival, but let me complicate life even further for you by telling you that I'm not going to talk about either economics or technology, but I'm going to talk about history. The topic of my talk today is to what extent is Indian history really true? It's a part of something I've been doing for many years now, which is writing popular history books. And over time, I've come to conclude that there are some very serious flaws with the way we think about Indian history. And I'm going to talk about some of those today. One of the things that you may have found quite commonly spoken about by people in casual conversation is that somehow we Indians are not particularly interested in our own history, that we are somehow a ahistorical people. Now, that's a very strange accusation to make for a people who are who embody what is perhaps the oldest continuous civilization. Perhaps the oldest continuous civilization on the planet. Even in casual conversation, we will refer to epics written in the Iron Age. We will talk about many historical things in casual conversation. So it is surely quite strange that we are very often told that we do not care for our history. Now, I will argue that one of the reasons that this impression comes through is because at the back of our minds, we perhaps do not believe our own history. And there is a good reason for this, because the history that you get in your textbooks is oddly enough not our history at all. It is really the history of hundreds of years of invaders who came into India. Have you noticed when you go through, and many of you will have suffered through history in your school years, you're engineering students, so you don't have to do it now, but certainly in your school years you had to suffer through textbooks, and you may have noticed that in none of the battles the Indians ever win. So you'll have the 3 battles of Panipat, and we always lose. And then there's the Battle of Plassey, and we always lose. And then, of course, there's the Battle of Buxar, we lost. And there's 1857, and we still lose. Now that surely is very odd, because after all, as I mentioned, we are the world's oldest continuous civilization, and surely we must have won a few battles. After all, this continuity of our civilization has been bought in blood. And it was not the case that our invaders and conquerors did not try very hard to sway us to their ways, but we did hold on. So obviously, there were many cases where we won, but we are never told about them. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these. Now, you will all know that between 1000 and 1025, India was invaded 17 times by Mahmud Ghazni. And the popular story is that a few years later, Muhammad Ghori came down from Afghanistan and effectively took over India and started the Turkic conquest of India. Now, these events are suggested as if there was no real resistance against this. This is absolutely not true. Mahmud Ghazni, in fact, did come into India 17 times, but there were several occasions on which he was given a very rough time, and in fact, on a couple of occasions, even repulsed. But more importantly, in about 1033 AD, a large Turkic army led by his nephew charged down from Afghanistan, charged across the Indian plains, and made its way to a place called Bharuch in central UP, where it was met by a relatively small army led by somebody called Suhail Deo Pasi. Now, I'm quite certain that nobody in this audience has ever heard of Suhail Deo Pasi or of the Battle of Bharuch. But in the Battle of Bharuch, Suhail Dev Pasi essentially decimated the Turkic army. And he did such a thorough job of it that for the next 150 years, no Turkic army charged down and came to India, which is why there is a 150-year difference between when Mahmud Ghazni came and Muhammad Ghori came. And after that, if you go throughout the history, I can tell you many other battles that the Indian side won systematically. Unless you are from Assam, for example, you would perhaps never have heard of somebody called Lasit Borphukan. Now, Lasit Borphukan is quite amazing because he took a very small Assamese army and he somehow managed to entice Aurangzeb's army at the height of his power onto a battle, a naval battle on the Brahmaputra, where he essentially sank the entire Mughal fleet. It was a devastating destruction, as a result of which the Mughals basically went into decline. And after that, you have, of course, the Marathas and Bundelas and so on. Then, of course, there is Baji Rao. Now, again, until this movie Baji Rao Mastani came around, I'm quite certain most of you had never even heard of Baji Rao. And Baji Rao is one of the great generals of not just Indian history or world history. He fought 41 battles and won all of them. That's a better record than Napoleon. And yet, he's almost never mentioned in our textbooks. In fact, you would get the impression from our textbooks that the British inherited India from the Mughals. And we simply leave out the 75 years where the Marathas ruled India. In fact, they ruled 2/3 of India. And it was really from the Marathas that the British conquered India. Then if you move further south, you have a king called Martanda Varma in Kerala. Again, many of you may have never heard of him unless you are from Kerala. In fact, several people in Kerala also have never heard of him. And this is really odd because Martanda Varma changed world history. He was the king of a relatively small kingdom, which later became Travancore, in the early 18th century. And in the early 18th century, the most powerful empire in the world, it is often forgotten, was that of the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company was the most powerful multinational force in the world. It had conquered what is now Indonesia, it had conquered Sri Lanka, and it was beginning to attempt to take over India. When this small kingdom, led by Martanda Varma, challenged them, and he managed to defeat the Dutch in a major battle in a place called Kolachal, which is very close to Kanyakumari. And after that defeat, the Dutch went into decline. And it is basically because of Martanda Varma that I'm giving you this talk in English and not in Dutch. I'm just giving you a bunch of random examples of great and important events in Indian history. But it is quite amazing that none of this is contained in our textbooks. In fact, not surprisingly, like every invader in every part of the world, those who took over our country retold their story according to their idea and essentially painted everything that happened before them as sort of the age of darkness. And one of the things they always would do is to present the fact that they ruled India or ruled any territory as if that they were providing civilization to that territory. Now, the Europeans, when they went to North America or Australia or Africa, did this very widely. So, for example, in Africa, the story was that they deserved to rule over large swaths of the continent because the locals were uncivilized and the Europeans were giving them civilization. And whenever evidence was found of previous older civilizations in Africa, it was always downplayed. For example, in what is now Zimbabwe, there is a huge city called Great Zimbabwe, after which the country is now named. Now, Great Zimbabwe clearly shows that there was an urban society existing in southern Africa before the Europeans came. So the Europeans very conveniently made up this story that this city was built by white-skinned people coming down from somewhere in the Mediterranean area in ancient times, and they must have built the city. The Africans surely were not capable of building the city. Now, when they conquered India, they also had to explain the fact that India clearly was an ancient civilization. So they scratched their heads And then they invented something called the Aryan invasion theory. The basic idea is that yes, you're an ancient civilization, but that civilization is not yours. It's some white-skinned people from Central Asia who came in and gave you this civilization. In other words, we can continue to rule over you because really the British rule over India is really a software update. Now, the funny thing is that there is actually no evidence for this Aryan invasion theory. No ancient Indian text mentions it. There is no genetic proof of it. There is no archaeological proof of it. In fact, till the end of the last ice age, there was nobody living in Central Asia. It was just too cold. The funny thing is that despite all of this, we have continued to perpetuate these myths left to us by the past and somehow continue to perpetuate them into the present. Let me clarify right in the beginning, however, that this is not to say that everything good about Indic civilization is indigenous. We are a great civilization because we took in many, many things from the rest of the world. Indian food, for example, would be unthinkable if you didn't have chilies, potatoes, tomatoes, etc., which were brought to us by the Portuguese from South America, or cricket, the English language, and so on, which was brought by the British. But it is also true that the same conquerors caused havoc in India, caused famine, large-scale genocide, and so on. And when we think about our history, it is important to think both of the good and the bad. And at the very least, what we need to do is to look at the evidence and look at what that evidence says before we decide on how to think about our history. Now, I've talked enough about how our history was mangled before independence. But sadly, after independence, we continue to perpetuate various myths because it suited certain political ends. Now, what I'm not going to do is to touch the more controversial characters in Indian history, such as Tipu Sultan or Aurangzeb or so on. I'm going to tell you how this happens even with a relatively less controversial character in the form of Ashoka the Great. Now, everybody from TV serials to textbooks to popular history, everybody agrees that he was a jolly good chap. And I'm going to show you that almost everything we know about him is in fact mythology. Now, Ashoka, as you know, was the third king of the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd century BC. And the story goes that he invaded Kalinga, and he saw the suffering during his invasion. He converted to Buddhism, became a pacifist, and everybody lived happily ever after under him. The whole thing, unfortunately, is based on almost no evidence. What we do know is that Ashoka was not the successor designated by his father. The crown prince, when Bindusara died, was away in the northwest. And when the king died, he rushed back to the capital, Pataliputra, hoping to become the king. Unfortunately, Ashoka, who was one of the more younger sons, happened to be in the capital at that time, and using Greek mercenaries, he captured the capital. And at the gates of Pataliputra, he had the crown prince killed. In fact, he was burnt alive. And then Ashoka proceeded to kill all the other male members of his family except one, who was his full brother Tissa. He basically massacred all the other male members. Then he carried out a major massacre of a lot of the ministers and others who may have opposed him. Now, after doing that, after a few years, having consolidated his power, he then invaded Kalinga. That bit too is true. However, he was already a Buddhist by the time he invaded. There is more than adequate evidence to show that he was a Buddhist when he invaded Kalinga. Having carried out this massacre in Kalinga, he did not, however, become a pacifist. There is a document called the Ashokavadana, which is used very widely by many of the historians who are writing about Ashoka. And the Ashokavadana clearly says that many years after the Kalingan war, Ashoka carried out major massacres, including one in Bengal where he killed 18,000 Ajivikas. Ajivikas were a sect which no longer exists, but was quite powerful at that time. There is another very well documented case where there was a Jain who was drawing a cartoon of a Buddhist bowing to a Tirthankara. Ashoka had this chap put inside a room along with his family, kids and everybody, and burnt the building down. And then he said that he would provide a gold coin for every head of a Jain that was brought to him. And this led to a massive massacre across the empire, which ended only when somebody mistook his only surviving brother as a Jain and cut his head off and brought his head. So this is the kind of thing that was going on. Now, whenever I bring this up, mainstream historians say, but you know, this was inserted into the text in much later times by fundamentalist Buddhists. So I say, maybe so, in which case you should use the same level of skepticism when you're looking at the rest of the text. How do you know which one is true and which is false? What was inserted later? We do not know. So if you're going to be skeptical, you have to look at the evidence as it is. Now, what then of this inscription in which he supposedly suggests that he has regret over this invasion? So I investigated that matter as well. So I went to Odisha and looked up all the inscriptions there are, and in not a single one of the inscriptions by Ashoka in Odisha does he show any regret. Surely, if he had such great regret, he would have wrote it in an inscription in Odisha. Instead, the only places where this so-called regret is mentioned is now currently in far away places, what is now Pakistan. And even in that inscription, you have to go beyond the little bit of the inscription that mentions his so-called regret and read the same inscription further down. So after he mentions, you know, I carried out this massacre, etc., in Kalinga and killed so many people and I'm feeling sort of bad about it, you carry on same inscription, go further down. He then says, you forest tribes, notwithstanding the regret I feel about killing all those chaps in Kalinga, if you behave badly, I will do the same thing to you. Now be very clear, this is not a pacifist. Now all this information that I'm giving you, I have deliberately stuck to information that one is used by mainstream economists, i.e. these inscriptions and that book Ashokavadana. I am not even getting into other data that maybe I can provide. I'm also only sticking to data that all of you, since all of you have 4G phones, all of you can right now Google it up. The inscription is online. The Ashokavadana in translation is also available online. So don't take my word for it. Please check it up. So I decided to find out how is it that this Ashoka became the great. And I discovered that actually he's not considered the great in Indian tradition at all. He was in fact more or less forgotten till the 19th century. And it is only in the 19th century that British archaeologists began to rediscover these inscriptions and began to decipher them. A gentleman called Prinsep basically deciphered these inscriptions, and that is how we basically rediscovered that there was such a king called, in fact his name is actually not even used there, it's called Devanam Priya Piyadasi, but later on we made some connections and figured out that it was indeed this king called Ashoka. But in the Indic tradition, the real great kings of the Mauryans is actually Chandragupta, his grandfather, and Chanakya. In our tradition, Ashoka has never been considered a great king. So his elevation to being considered a great king is partly because of British rediscovery of this king in the 19th century. And then, and this is where it gets interesting, and then his elevation in really the second, third, fourth decades of the 20th century. And it happened for a very interesting reason. So I began to look into why this would happen. I discovered that it had a lot to do with the politics of that time. You see, by the 1930s, it became quite obvious that India was going to become independent in the next few decades. It was a matter of time. And there were different groups of people who were trying to vie and sort of position themselves to becoming the leader of this country. They were the upcoming leaders of the time, which of course included the socialists led by Pandit Nehru. Now, Pandit Nehru was essentially looking for a lineage for his own thoughts. Now, the obvious place to look for lineage for your political thoughts is to look at Chanakya's Arthashastra, which in fact had been relatively recently translated at that time. But the problem with the Chanakya's Arthashastra is that it is completely not conducive to socialism. It's totally not a welfarist document. It is all about a strong but limited state. The role of the state is to guard the boundaries of the country, its internal security, it is rule of law, enforcement of contracts, and so on. But intervention in people's lives, welfarism is totally not Chanakya's thing. So, having discovered that Chanakya was not going to be very helpful, Nehru and his contemporary socialists basically came upon Ashoka. And Ashoka in his inscription says all kinds of very nice things which can easily be used to justify a nanny state. Ashoka says, I am the father to my people. They are like children to me. He then goes on to say that I am going to institute officers called the Dharma Mahamantas, who will act like nannies to my people. He literally describes a nanny state. And then he goes on and makes a whole bunch of things about how to intervene in people's lives. So, you shall not castrate a bull on the 3rd day and the 5th day of the 4th night, on 3 days of Tissa and 1 day of Chaturmasi. It's a very, very interventionist mindset. And it is perfect because that is what Nehru wanted to do. So basically, this new emerging group of people, because it suited their political view, began to build up Ashoka as this early socialist from the 3rd century BC, and quietly brushed all the nasty things about him in the history books into the under the carpet. And so was born Ashoka the Great. Now, some of you may be thinking that this fellow, Sanjeev Sanyal, is a real conspiracy theorist. But always remember that, Pandit Nehru was very aware of myth building. He was himself writing his own histories. Remember, he is a man who awarded himself the Bharat Ratna. If you don't believe me, again, use your phones, look it up when he got the Bharat Ratna. 1955. Who was the Prime Minister of India in 1955? Now, this happens to be, incidentally, India's highest civilian award. In fact, India's highest award, period. And the procedure is, the Prime Minister of India personally writes to the President recommending the name of the person. So I can imagine what the letter looked like. So somebody tried to RTI and get the letter, but I'm telling you what I think the letter must have read like. Dear President Radhakrishna, Sir, yesterday I met a nice chap called Jawahar. He's a jolly nice chap. We should definitely award him the Bharat Ratna. Love and kisses, Nehru. Now, you really think this guy couldn't have done it? Guess what? While he was Prime Minister, he instituted Children's Day on his own birthday. Don't believe it? The first Children's Day is in 1953. On his own birthday, he instituted Children's Day. Of course, we all know he loved his own children. So, which brings me back to what this talk is really about. The point is that Indian history, as you read it in your textbooks, is really layer on layer on layer of nonsense. And consequently, because we know that there's something somewhat unsavory about the whole thing, we end up giving the impression that we don't care about our history. In fact, we really do care about our history if we are told the truth. The good news is that you happen to live in a time that a lot of this information is becoming much more easily available. An amateur like me can hunt down important facts. In fact, since I have given up on the history departments, I'm hoping the engineering department will take this up and begin to investigate some of the original facts and evidences on which many of the very big major events of our history are based. And you'll be surprised to the extent to which a lot of this is twisted and turned in various ways. Now, of course, all history is told from some perspective. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody is allowed their own opinion. But everybody is not allowed, in fact, nobody is allowed their own facts. So, since there is always a debate about how history books should be written or whether or not they should be revised, my view would be, using the argument that the current government may come up and put right-wing biases in it is no excuse for perpetuating colonial era or Marxist era or socialist era biases. What we do need to do is to have a much more genuine debate about our own history. I think the only way that this can be achieved is by doing the following thing. First, let us agree on what the evidence is and be honest about it and present it honestly. Whatever it says, good, bad, ugly, present it reasonably honestly. Then, after that, allow for a multitude of different interpretations of that history to be presented. Unfortunately, because of a variety of reasons, using state patronage, much of this history has been only a one stream that is presented and embedded into our textbooks and then consequently into the general discussion. I think they should allow for multiplicity. As long as they are reasonable views and they are based on the evidence, I think this should be allowed. After all, we do not mostly even agree about things that happened last week. Just watch Arnab Goswami every evening. How on earth do you expect us to agree with what happened 2,500 years ago? Obviously, we do not agree. So it is okay to disagree. But what we have to do at least is to be honest about the facts. And then all reasonable views should be accepted. A multiple of them should be presented. Now, there is a good thing that will come out of all of this. One is, of course, it will be more honest. But the other thing is that history will now become much more interesting. It will become an exploration of the past rather than a memorization of random dates. Really, frankly, I couldn't care less about the Morley-Minto reform or Akbar's Mansabdari system if I could learn about much more interesting things. So I think that would be what would happen, is that we would get much more flexibility, much more exploratory in the way we think about our past. But I think in the end, it is very, very important for us in order to keep this civilization alive, to feel pride for it, we need to tell our own story. Because remember, as an old African saying goes, until the lions have their own storytellers, the history of the world will always glorify the hunter. Thank you. I'm very happy to answer questions. Yes, the gentleman there. Does somebody have a mic or something? Yeah.
Hello. How do you get interested in history after the successful example?
Okay.
Number 2 question is that what is the motive behind the people writing nonsense in the history?
Writing?
What is the motive behind the people who are writing nonsense in the history?
Okay. So why I got interested in history is actually through a completely different line. I'm not a person who liked history in school, but later in life I began to discover that history matters in many ways, because without understanding one's history, i.e. where one came from, one cannot explain where one is going. So I got interested in that, and then I began digging up various things over time. I live in Southeast Asia, I live in Singapore, and for example, it's amazing how much influence there is of India all over Southeast Asia. I mean, I live in a city called Singhapura, Singapore. If you go through Indonesia, right next door is Indonesia. There's enormous influence of Indian civilization in Indonesia and across Southeast Asia, so much so that when Indonesians became free, they named their kingdom, their new country after us. They named their currency, the rupiah, after our currency. So this is not some theoretical influence. It is a real living influence. So I thought that it is important to begin exploring this, and as I began to explore this, I discovered that you can begin to think about the whole thing in a completely different way. So that is the answer to your first question. So what was the second? Nonsensical history. I don't think they're nonsensical at all, you see. It's a lot to do with myth building and how you create impressions and debates and end up framing the debate. For example, you will hear very often in colonial history that India is not a country, that it's a geographical term, that it has never been a nation. Now, it is true that the present boundaries and the present nation state of India is born in 1947. But there is plenty of evidence in our history to show that we have been conscious of being a civilization, a civilizational nation for a very long time. And we are not even unique in that. The Chinese, for example, have been very conscious of being Chinese for a very, very long time. Now, their boundaries as they stand today is new. This was also true of the Jews, who didn't even have a territory, but they have had a memory of being a civilizational nation for a long time. The Greeks had such a sense of themselves as a civilizational nation. Sparta and Athens fought with each other all the time, but whenever the Persians turned up, they united and fought them. So this idea of a civilization nation is not new. So why is it that even today, very often scholars will perpetuate this myth about us not being a nation? I mean, I understand why the British did it, because that justified their rule, but why do we do it? The reason is, you see, if we existed as a nation before 1947, you can't have a father of the nation. And if you cannot have a father of the nation, you cannot have a Chacha of the nation. It has got a lot to do with the myth building of how you say that we created this country and therefore you owe it to us to allow us to rule it forever. And therefore, alternative histories of India simply swept under the carpet. And I'll just give you a few examples. You never hear about major movements towards contributions to Indian history from alternative sources, like, for example, the revolutionaries. There was a major thing, none of our history books tell us about the Gadar movement, which was a huge movement, which came, in fact, within 72 hours of causing a major revolt, which may indeed have succeeded. Very few of you would have even heard of the great naval revolt of 1946, which has happened in living memory. It happened in 1946. 18,000 sailors across India, but particularly in Bombay, revolted in 1946. They were war veterans. Remember, this is just after the Second World War. They took control of a large number of battleships. They're fully armed, and they basically declared independence. And if they wanted, they could have taken control of large parts of India without working very hard, because when the British government of the time told the Indian Army and the Royal Indian Air Force to attack them, they refused. But it is very inconvenient to our myth-making that this event, rather than other events, led to our independence. So therefore, almost nobody is told about this. I'm quite certain many of you have never heard about this naval revolt. Even worse, both the soldiers of the Indian National Army and the sailors of the naval revolt were all dismissed from, of course, their forces. But even after independence, which happened just a year later, none of them were taken back in. And many of them died in dire poverty. Why? Because they did not fit the dominant stream of history. It's absolutely pathetic, but that is how, unfortunately, our history was written. So it does matter. This is not nonsensical history. It's deliberately done. Yes? Okay, what was the first question, sorry? Actually, the Mongols did invade India. There were several rounds of them. The first and earliest round was that they invaded Delhi, and they defeated Alauddin Khilji and essentially pushed him into the Siri fort. He was stuck there for 6 months. He just about survived it. So the Mongols did come. Then a few hundred years later, the Mongols came back. Remember, Mughals were Mongols. That's where the word comes from. So Babur was a Mongol. So they did come to India a little bit later from the Genghis Khan period, but in a later period, and they did set up an empire in India and did have an influence on our civilization. So it is not the case that the Mongols didn't come. They came in 2 waves, and in the second wave, they did stay for a pretty long period of time. So that is the first question. The second question is about Gandhi. Yes, I mean, I am a big votary of thinking about alternative ways of thinking about history. We will perhaps tomorrow find out something quite interesting about the whole thing, about Netaji, for example, although I wouldn't hold my breath, because I think all the interesting files have long disappeared. But nevertheless, the point is there are alternative ways of thinking about history. I cannot comment about those specific events, because that's not a part of my thing. I'm really here to question the authenticity rather than to question motives of well-known events. So I will not get into that, because it's a side debate. But I take your point that, you know, we need to think about it much more widely than from the official history given to us. Yes, the gentleman at the back, yes. So I think that will be a somewhat different line of thought, because I'm not here really, that's a different debate. I'm here really to debate the authenticity of the narrative rather than what actually happened. There are many reasons. Of course, there could have been alternative histories. For example, if the Ghadar movement had succeeded in 1915, well before the whole idea of Pakistan came about, then you wouldn't have had it. So history, unfortunately, is contingent, i.e., at a certain point in time, events suddenly take you in a certain direction, and then it just goes that way. It could have gone in a completely different way. You know, it's a debate that's a much longer debate than I can engage in here. But it is the case that it is not obvious to me that that partition was definitely going to happen. Let me go a little bit on this side. There's a gentleman here who wants to. Okay, well, he asked the question and then him. Okay, yeah.
Told that we should study facts properly and agree on them before analyzing the history. So recently a book came by Benjamin Weiner in Blue on history. And so my question is that are we as a society mature enough to take facts as they are? Because that book was very good and it really analyzed some parts, but it got banned.
So I am totally of the view that books should not be banned. It does not matter what they are. But in order for a book to be considered genuine, the facts have to be presented clearly and the interpretations. Now, I have some problems with some of the facts in that book, incidentally. But nevertheless, that is no reason to ban it. My view is that the book should be allowed, and if somebody disagrees, should write an alternative book and say that these facts are not right or whatever. To ban any book, incidentally, the book is not banned. Despite all what newspapers say, you can go into any bookshop when you go next to Calcutta and see it. This whole story about it banned is itself a great case of wrong evidence. It was withdrawn by the publisher and bought by another publisher and republished. So it is available across India. You can go right now, check it up on Amazon.in. So that itself is a good example of how evidence is misrepresented. Whatever it is, it was not banned. The publisher took it back, and another publisher has republished it. It's not banned. There's no state involvement in that whole episode, and it's available. The fact is, in the end, your interest is in availability. It's available. Yes.
Hello. Given that we have well-documented proof regarding that Emperor Ashok was not a pacifist, what would be the procedure to rewrite the textbooks that we currently read in schools? So the history that we are being taught in schools, what would be the procedure to?
So my view, the correct would be to put down clearly what the evidence is about this king. And once you put down the evidence on Ashoka, you can, it's possible that some people will still think he's a great guy. It's perfectly fine. But then, once the evidence is clear, there will be others who, like myself, don't think so. And incidentally, there have always been some people who have questioned this narrative, but their narrative has always been deliberately almost suppressed out of the mainstream discussion. I'm just bringing it out. So what I am arguing for is, one, clear evidence giving. Honestly, whatever it is, good, bad, ugly. Two, to recognize that this evidence evolves, not just in this case, in other cases, genetic data comes up, climate data comes up, new archaeological finds are made. So again, honesty in terms of putting this new data onto as they appear. And thirdly, to be honest, that in the end, history is, to a fair extent, deals with interpretation. And it's perfectly fine to have different interpretations, but I think using state patronage to simply perpetuate one stream of thought is totally wrong. And that's what I'm arguing against. I think the textbooks do need to be changed, but and to use the excuse that, oh, there will be new biases put in is not an excuse, because all you're doing is perpetuating old biases. Put in the facts clearly and put in alternative views. I think India is mature enough to understand that if we can take Arnab Goswami every evening, we can take our textbooks.
Has there been any such attempt to?
Hello?
Has there been any such attempt to bring it to the notice of the government of India that we have documented proof with respect to that Emperor Ashok did in fact?
Yes, it's documented proof. You can. Why documented proof? You can actually look it up on the internet. This book, Ashoka Vadana, in translation, is available on the net. So and it's been well known for a long, long time.
No, that's right. But has this been brought to the notice of the government of India, and that?
Well, I've written
has there been
articles
attempt-
about it. Many people in the government read these articles and have talked to me about it, so people are aware. But I have just taken this as a random example simply because he's not that controversial. But if you go and there is lots of rest of Indian history is also there are lots of this. It's all throughout the textbooks. I gave you another example of the naval mutiny, which is just not mentioned. So the whole textbooks is full of this stuff. I'm just saying, bring it back. If there are other ways to think about history, why shouldn't we know other sources of these things, other ways of thinking about it?
Sir, I have two questions for you here.
Where are you, sorry?
Yeah.
Are there? Okay.
First one is, sir, do you consider yourself a historian or just an history enthusiast? Because how do we consider that your work is authentic? I think it is like Chetan Bhagat is writing about biology, and you as an economist is writing about history. So how do we consider that your work is totally authentic? Because, sir, just a minute, sir.
Yeah.
Because we have so many authors who consider themselves historians, but they are not historians. They just write fictional history, like Shivaji Sawant, Vishwas Patil, and even the recent case of Purandare, Babasaheb Purandare writing about Shivaji Maharaj. So,
First
and
of all,
second question, sir, just a minute. Second question, you mentioned about the mass pogrom of Jain monks by Ashoka, and do you have any evidence about it? Like
Yes.
historians talks with the help of facts and proofs.
Yes.
So, do you have any proofs about it?
So first of all, as I just pointed out to you, being or not being a specialist historian has clearly does not provide authenticity. That's the point I'm trying to make. So the question is, should I have a right to do it? Yes, every citizen of India has a right to look at the evidence. I happen to come from a different field, and by the way, I will not be the first person in history to have come from a different field and made a contribution to another field. Science is full of it. Economics is full of it. Some of the greatest finds in economics have come from mathematicians, not from economists, and so on. So this is, I think, at some level, it doesn't matter. The question is about evidence. That, I agree, is absolutely, and if you read my writings, I always give evidence. In fact, I have only given evidence here that you can, sitting in this room, authenticate you on using your phone. I can give you lots of tons more evidence on this, which I publish in my writings. My next book, it's a history of the Indian Ocean, will also contain some more evidence on this. So look up the evidence yourself.
But
And
so
make
then
up your
what
mind.
would be the literary value of your works? Like,
That is for the people to decide. My people read my book. They go up and look up the references. Literary value is not decided by the Sahitya Academy. It should be decided by people. Yes.
Okay, sir. So I have two questions. One bit more specific and another generic. So, what is your view about the most controversial figure in Mughal history, Aurangzeb?
Okay, in that particular case, there is a lot of evidence, documentary and otherwise, of foreign travelers who were in India at that point in time. It's not an event that happened particularly long back. So the fact that he was a bigot is actually very well documented. And you can go and see many of the temples and other things he destroyed. There cannot be any debate about this. I do not even know why there is a debate. Just look at the amount of evidence on this. So rather than taking an ideological view on the matter, look at the evidence. And the evidence is quite clear. And if you don't think it convinces you, that's fine. But you cannot deny the amount of evidence that is there.
So, but if we...
We have to let another person ask.
Okay.
First. Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a person at the back. Oh, no.
Sir,
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there's a gentleman right in front who wants to ask. How are we doing for time? Are we doing okay? Two more questions. There's a gentleman here, and then one more after that. And there's a person over there. Okay, there's a third one there as well. Okay, we'll take up. Three, okay.
Okay, Islam started in Egypt. Islam started in Africa from tribal background. Okay.
Arabia, not Africa, but anyway, carry on.
Islam originated in Africa from tribal background. Okay. So in tribal background, what we see is men and women are treated equally, and women are more or less more free. But how this hijab thing crept into Islam?
I have no idea. I'm not an expert on Islam, so you will have to excuse me on that.
good evening, sir. Here. Sir, since we are talking about Indian history and the epic Ramayana and Mahabharata are also the part of the history, so how far you agree with the actual existence of the characters and all these stories, and is it true?
You mean the authenticity of the epics?
Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting question, and I'll tell you why. You see, in the Indian tradition, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are considered itihasa, i.e. history. Now, the way people think of history, unfortunately, is that it is a series of political events and they have to be authenticated. Now, obviously, with these two epics, it's very, very difficult to do. Now, as a person who writes not on political history but on geographical history, I have actually dug up a lot of stuff about the geography of India from the epics. So take, for example, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata are quite interesting because the events of the Mahabharata happen on an east-west axis. See, Gandhari comes from Gandhar, which is Afghanistan. And on the other hand, you have Manipur, where Chitrangada is. So east-west axis. And the Ramayana happens on a north-south axis, right? Now, that is not entirely by chance, incidentally, because the events roughly follow up and down two of the major highways of ancient India, which were the Uttara Path, which went east-west, and the Dakshina Path, which went north-south. And so that is one very interesting fact in itself. Secondly, many of the places mentioned there in the Ramayana are actually real places. So, for example, Kishkinda, which was the place where the monkey kingdom was. Now, if you go to Kishkinda, which is incidentally just across from the ruins of Vijayanagar at Hampi, it's just across the Tungabhadra, it is amazing because it is exactly like how it is described in the text. It's strange rock outcrops and hills with caves and lots of monkeys. And just next door is a bear reserve which has sloth bears, which, remember, Jambuwan? So that entire landscape really does exist. Similarly, if you go to Dhanushkoti and Rameshwaram, there really is a series of sandbars that connects India to Sri Lanka. Now, whether you believe it's a geological feature or you believe it's a human-made feature, it's up to your belief. But the fact is it exists. And somebody sitting in the Iron Age in the Gangetic Plains knew about these places and wrote about them. Now, of course, the events there could still be completely fictional because when even today people write fiction, they use real places. So I think this does not provide any sense of the authenticity of the events of these epics, but it does provide that they were talking about a real landscape. That is one. However, there is a deeper sense in which the epics are itihasa. Because you see, these epics were overlaid and overlaid and overlaid with new thoughts and interpolations over time. Let's take, for example, the Mahabharata. You have all kinds of insertion into it, including the Bhagavad Gita. Or you take the Ramayana. The Ramayana starts out very early on as a simple story of adventure of Ram and Sita, a story of love and adventure, which basically ends with the killing of Ravan and they go home. That's the end of the story. And the oldest versions of the story are like that. Then at some point in time, an additional layer is put on it, which becomes not about Ram and the adventure, but about the rule of law, about the enforcement of contract, that the king too has to be below the law. So therefore, the Ramayana then becomes about Ram following the law, irrespective of the cost to himself. So his father tells him to go on exile. It's a completely unfair. His father even dies, but he still follows the law. The law says that Sita has to be sent away. It's completely unfair. He pines for her. He hates it, but he follows the law. Why? Because the debate of that time is about the rule of law. The king too is below the law. And of course, not everybody agreed with it. So you have a parallel character in the Mahabharata, Krishna, who breaks all the laws. So this is what the debate of that time is. And then some more time passes. And then what happens is you have interaction between Hinduism and the monotheistic religions. And so Ram goes from being Purushottam Ram, i.e. the great man, to becoming Bhagwan Ram, the God. That's where the context in which the Tulsi Ramayana is written. So what is happening? You are layer on layer adding the ideas, debates, etc. So in a very much more deeper sense, the epics are indeed our itihasa. But they are not the itihasa of our political events. They are the itihasa of our civilization. They are our civilizational memory. They are the memory of our own debates. They are the memory of our ideas, of our greatest joys, of our deepest fears. That is what they are. And so in that sense, they are indeed history. Yes. Oh, that was a long discussion then. Well, I think some of the ideas the current Prime Minister has is certainly worth implementing. Now he has to get on with the job and implement it. So I'm waiting for him to do it. It's, I mean, he's had 18 months so far. We'll see. So I'm generally, pro-market economist. So I hope that he will take a pro-market approach to developing our economy. So let's see. We'll get a budget in a few weeks.
So one more question that
Yes.
you had told that we guys do not have much knowledge about some more leaders like Baji Rao and all.
Yes.
Sir, but we have on our initial courses like in NCERT, our NCERT courses, the syllabus has not changed from several years. Then how can we get to know about them in our initial levels?
So this is precisely what I'm attempting to do, is to start a debate. Unfortunately, all debate about our textbooks gets stalled by this argument that, oh no, if you do this, then you will add all these other biases, as if it is not biased already. So the point I'm trying to do here is, let's not go into this debate at all. Present the evidence. Number one, there are many changes you can make which shouldn't be at all controversial. One is that we've got to stop having our history books as if it's the history of Delhi. There are many other things happening across India and we never hear about it. Baji Rao, an example. There are major empires like the Chola Empire, which you never hear about, or the Vijayanagara Empire. I mean, it was a major place. You don't hear very much about it. You don't hear about the Odia, for example, who were some of the great mariners of the ancient world, and they went all the way, explored the sea routes all the way to Southeast Asia, going all the way to Vietnam and so on, in 3rd century BC, 4th century BC, very early on. In fact, so much so that they settled Sri Lanka even before the Tamils, who are right next door, went there. So this is why the Sinhalese are of Odia Bengali origin, even though Bengal and Odisha are so far away, and they became the majority population of Sri Lanka. So the point I'm making is there is lots of interesting history in India, which doesn't have to do with the the kings of Delhi. So that is one thing that can be changed without. I mean, what is there to debate on this? Secondly, even on these other characters, I think we need to pull out of it systematic biases that have been almost embedded into our history telling by the fact that we were, that after independence, we were interested in perpetuating some of these myths for political reasons and pull these out. I mean, why should we not tell our own story? As I said, all other countries after becoming free have done this. Why shouldn't we? I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. Really, it was enlightening to all of us, and give him a big applause. Now, somebody asked related to background. Isn't it amazing to say that all of you are actually, of course, people are there from other colleges, but I can say almost all of you are from engineering background, but you are so much interested about history. So what it matters is not your background, but your interest in that work and specific topic.
Well, let me say that since the historians are doing such a bad job of writing history, I'm hoping the engineers will take it up.
Yes, and I would like to tell you just one small thing, that IIT Kharagpur has also got a very unique initiative called Sandhi. And there are many interesting works, even related to history, related to language, culture, that are being explored. So it is, I completely agree with you and accept it, that probably people from different fields come together and explore it. What is more important, are we exploring it in a scientific way, in an evidence-based manner? So may I now request Professor Joy Sen, who is with us, to please come over to the stage and just a very few concluding words, because he is the person who has got immense interest in this area, and he is the institute coordinator for this mega project Sandhi. Okay, so, and also to offer our token of respect and token of memento to Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. I think he will be the most appropriate person to conclude.
So we have a great soul from Simhapuram, from Singapore. And it was amazing to see how a man from the logic of oikos, which is economics, moves into history and ecology. And that's what happens when an architect like me moves into history, language, and music. And I think many students and young souls out here, they belong to this new journey, new adventure, new risks. And as you said, looking for new evidences. It was really a pleasure, and it was amazing. And there was a whole array of questions on the left wing and the right wing, as you can say, which is very honest. I mean, our students, as it seemed on face value, are very honest to ask their honest questions. And the answers were even more amazing. I think everyone will agree to that. We invite this wonderful personality from Singapore to be a part of our Science and Heritage Initiative, which is Sandhi.
Thank you.
That is the request because I think we had read a few of his lines while we had entered a very ancient city which is still sustainable, which is Varanasi. Yes. We had read some of your lines, and it was Professor Rajiv Sangal, Director, IIT BHU, who had actually handed over a book of yours to ours. Okay. Yeah. And we read those lines, and before we had gone into Varanasi, we thought we are urban planners, we are urban engineers. That's what Professor Maitra is. We are going to change Varanasi. And then after making a couple of visits, we had a feeling that Varanasi is changing us. That's what happens. It's kind of a dialogue between the kind of things which we think before and the kind of things which we'll be thinking later. And definitely a balance between the two. And I think in that sense of maintaining a scientific, a neutral, a dispassionate balance of evidences, so well said in this almost 1 hour, or a little less than that talk, which could have gone a little farther. It was really amazing to have Dr. Subrata Sarnal with us in this second day. Sanjeev Sarnal with us in this amazing event of Kshitij, which is a techno-social management phase. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank
I
you.
think a big hand.
So this is the moment not to say goodbye, but a welcome to IIT Kharagpur for the Sandhi initiative.
So this is on behalf of IIT Kharagpur and our little humble Sandhi initiative to Subrata Sarnal. Sanjeev Sarnal. I don't know why Subrata is coming again and again. Sanjeev Sarnal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.